Hey, welcome everybody to Reconsidering Research Data and Evidence for Development. That's the main session, and then at 5 o'clock we're going to do a thing with DICE, and it's called Share and Connect. And I've been given instructions to take you through that. That'll go from 5 to 5:30, at which point you can rack off to the bar. So just bear that in mind. My name's Tom Davis. I'm from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I've got great joy in chairing this session. We've got 4 speakers, Francesca Earp from James Cook University, Nikki Bartlett, who's from Clear Horizon, Ujwal Krishna. Can you hear us, Ujwal?
I can, thanks.
Great. From La Trobe, and Kate Bennett from UTS. And they're going to look at a variety of takes on this really important subject. And so without further ado, Francesca, take it away. I forgot one important chair thing. Apologies, Francesca. No worries. Apologies. Those online, I'll be observing the chat in Hoover, so if you've got any questions, please put them on the chat function, and I'll then put them to the speakers. Apologies for that. Over to you, Francesca.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to be reflecting on Feminist Participatory Action Research, which I'll refer to as FPAR, and this presentation is probably going to leave you with more questions than answers because I'm mostly just posing questions at the moment myself, but we'll sort of have a reflection on that. Where am I clicking to? There we go. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, acknowledging that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So as I mentioned, today's discussion is a reflection of my application of an FPAR methodology throughout my PhD. I'm going to really quickly just run you through the basics of my PhD and some key actors involved in that process. So my PhD was looking at gender-targeted development in Laos People's Democratic Republic, and really I was just looking at the factors that influence how gender-targeted development is enacted. I had the privilege of working with a local civil society organisation known as the Rural Development Agency, or RDA. And the RDA were actually enacting a gender-targeted program. So I was able to watch as they enacted that activity. And I'll refer to that program as the UCA Women's Project. In general, that was a climate resilience program. So it was working with UCA women, and the idea was that women could lead climate resilience within their villages. So Laos is a landlocked country in Southeast Asia. There's a real rise in development programming in the country, specifically gender-targeted development, which is why I was really working in that area. And Laos is a very ethnic diverse country, and the Aka are a small ethnic minority based in northern Laos. So the Aka Women's Project was working specifically with that ethnic group. They're very remote, so that purple circle at the top of the map is the province, Luang Namtha, where I was conducting the Aka Women's Project with the RDA. So very briefly, I'm going to run you through the idea of why I applied an FPAR methodology. Throughout my PhD, I knew that I wanted to apply a participatory approach to the research, and that was because I was working with a lot of different development actors and I was collaborating with the RDA. And so I was cognizant that I didn't want to have power hierarchies present within that research space. So I was looking at PAR, Participatory Action Research, which, to put it very basically, is this idea that we really work with what would traditionally be referred to as participants, and instead they actually become co-researchers, so they're collaborating within that research space. So given that my research was about gender-targeted development, it felt like it was a really logical next step to go into FPAR, because the F that adds on to PAR is feminism. So to me, that looked like the obvious next step. And really what FPAR does is adds on to PAR, but really has a focus on a feminist lens and really centering marginalized women's experiences throughout the research process. So my PhD, which was 3 cycles of a PAR process, was applying an FPAR methodology. But actually the RDA, who were applying the ACCA Women's Project, were applying a PAR methodology. And I was surprised by this because being a women's project, you would think that an FPAR methodology would also be applicable. But actually what the RDA told me is that FPAR didn't fit because feminism felt colonial. And they told me that the government was very skeptical of anything that was referred to as a feminist project, and that also just like this centering of women didn't feel applicable regardless of the fact that it was an ACCA women's project. So it was this real distinction of like, what is FPAR, what does the F do in FPAR, that really led to my reflections throughout my PhD, which I want to kind of unpack with you today. So in theory, if we really think about FPAR as the acronym, which it is, theoretically, the F is supposed to be this feminist lens, the P is supposed to be this participatory approach, the action is supposed to be that the community identifies gaps that they want to fill, and then they actually lead the responses. And then the R is research. But then in practice, what I found is actually both the F and the feminism and the participation were quite Western. And so there were these Western models that we were applying, and that actually the action was often controlled by the researcher rather than by the communities, which was the idea of the process. So I want to kind of unpack my issues with each of those letters with you today. So the first is this F in FPAR. As I mentioned, the F is really grounded in Western feminist theory. And so with that comes this real centering of women. So it's about women in participatory approaches. And so it kind of led me to a few questions. The first question was, do we need the F in FPAR? As I mentioned, the RDA actually were not applying the F through their ACCA Women's Project. And that really surprised me because as I watched the RDA enact the ACCA Women's Project, a lot of it seemed to be very feminist. So they had given the ACCA women the primary caretakers of their children. They had little play areas at the back so women could bring their children and still participate fully. There's a lot of illiteracy in ACCA women because of language barriers across the ethnic minority groups. And so they were really conscious to make sure that the research was accessible to the women. And so all of these things they were doing seemed to me like an FPAR approach. And it was actually when I worked with the RDA that they said to me, well, if it's participatory, then wouldn't it be inclusive of everyone? And so why do we need this feminist lens when is participation? Wouldn't it also mean that we were trying to include the women in the room? So that was that first question of, well, what is this F doing in this FPAR? The second question was whether or not men should be included in FPAR processes. In the early cycles of the ACCA Women's Project, I was really leading our F or PAR, depending on which of us you were asking, approach. And I was really conscious, based off the theory I'd read, that we needed to create women-only spaces. That's what FPAR often tells us, that we create these safe spaces for women. So when I was finding ACCA interpreters, I was only working with women interpreters. I was making sure the village chief wasn't in the room so women could speak openly. And then in later sessions, the RDA kind of took over and I took more of an observational role. And what I saw is that they employed male interpreters and that the village chief sat in the room and male provincial staff, and that it didn't create this uncomfortable energy that I had assumed it would. And in fact, the ACCA women would refer back to the men and they would ask them to validate their experiences of what they were telling us. And actually, this reflects a bigger finding of my PhD in general, which is that when we apply these women-centric approaches, we remove men from the equation. And what that does is, in one sense, it creates a burden on the women because the women are then responsible for improving gender equity, which is a difficult thing to do when it's relational. But also it means that we really set ourselves into this gender binary of men and women, and we remove any opportunities for gender diversity in those spaces as well. So these were some questions that really came about based off what does the F in FPAR do? The next question was then, what does participation look like? A lot of the theory tells us that participation should be really equal and that there's this equal approach of the primary researcher is no much more in charge of the research than the co-researchers. But what does that look like in practice? So the first question I had to ask is who controls the methodology? This question became really prominent with my relationship with the RDA, because what was happening in our planning sessions is I was so conscious that I wanted to apply a participatory approach that anytime anyone said anything, I would go, yes, and let's do that and this. And we would keep trying to build and evolve because I wanted everyone to have a voice. Eventually, one of my RDA collaborators said to me, "You're being a bit of a playboy," which I didn't really understand what that meant. And what they told me is they felt I was flirting with all these different methods and that I had no clear path of the way I was going. And that was quite like a difficult criticism to take, because in theory, that's what I thought FPAR should look like. But at the end of the day, the project had to be enacted. There was a timeline. My PhD eventually had to be finished. And so there were activities that need to be done. So eventually someone has to say, this is where the methodology ends and this is how we enact it. And my question became, well, who's in charge of doing that and who actually has the final say in this participatory approach? The next question was whether or not the participation had to be equal. This really came about with the ACA women themselves. The RDA and I were really conscious that we wanted the women to feel like they were co-researchers, not participants. So we made uniforms. So the blue vests you can see are their co-researcher uniform. And on the back, it says researcher in Lao language. And we created activities like the one here, where everybody needed to participate and everyone in the village needed to have voice in the activity. And what happened very quickly is that the wife of the village chief, who was the most senior woman in the room, took over, and she would start rubbing out other people's answers if they went against what the group consensus should be. Again, that made me feel really uncomfortable because that's not my idea of participation in this equal approach. But what I observed was the RDA just simply created spaces for what they thought participation should look like, and then they let the community define how they wanted to participate. So if it meant that it was only the village chief's wife, then that was okay, because it was just voice to the community, and then they could follow their normal processes of how they wanted to display their voice. And so then we have this question of what's the action and who actually controls what the action should look like. In FPAR theory, we're often really told this idea that community should see that there's this issue, you should work through with them on that research process, and then eventually the community will lead that activity. So in the ACA Women's Project, the idea was that we'd work with the women, they would identify areas within climate resilience that they wanted to lead, the women would design their leadership response, and then they would lead that activity. And in theory, that sounds lovely, right? The community is really taking ownership of the activities. But then in practice, there's this question of who actually defines the action in FPAR approaches. I think it might be nice to tell you a quick story to really answer this question here. So when we were first conducting the ACA Women's Project, the women continuously told both myself and the RDA that they really wanted a new play equipment for their children. And it was something they constantly brought up throughout the activities. But a play equipment doesn't really align with a climate resilience activity. And we didn't know how to go back to the funder who was funding the ACA Women's Project and say the climate response is a new playground. And so eventually we just had to continue asking the women, well, if you think about climate, what would you then like? And really redirect the conversation back to that climate agenda. Then we came back a few months later, and as you can see in this image, there was a brand new play equipment. So I asked the women, well, where did this play equipment come from? And they told me, oh, it came from the water project that was working here. And you might think, well, how does a play equipment align with water in the same way that it didn't align with climate? I can't speak specifically to why the water project gave the women a playground, but what I can tell you based off my PhD is that I learnt there is this constant negotiation that's occurring. And so it didn't align with the water project to provide a playground, but they did need community buy-in and they needed that activity. And so instead, there's this push and pull of what the set agenda is and what the action should be about based off how to actually get community to be involved. And so what we're beginning to see is like whose agenda defines that action. Because for the ACA Women's Project, it was the donor's agenda that it had to be about climate, regardless of the fact that the women really just wanted a playground for their children. So what are the ways forward? I don't want this to be really doom and gloom, and I also don't want you to go away thinking FPAR is not an appropriate methodology to apply, because I don't think that's what I've found. As I said, I'm still working it through, which is why I say I don't think. But I think what I found is that the way that we should actually apply FPAR methodologies is to really work with communities and create this true sense of localization. And I don't mean that in the buzzword sense. And what I actually think about the methodology of FPAR is that it mirrors the bigger questions of my PhD. And my PhD really found that there is this gap between the ideology and reality. So we have this ideological vision of development, and then we have what's occurring on the ground, and those two aren't necessarily bridging with one another. And I think the FPAR methodology is a really nice way of reflecting that in a smaller sense, because we have this theoretical perception of what feminism should look like, what participation should look like, how communities should identify and act. And then actually in reality, there are all these reasons why it might sound good in theory, but it doesn't work in reality. So instead, I think the way that we do that is we really have a constant sense of self-reflection. And so we think when somebody tells us we're being a playboy with our methodology, we reflect back on that and we work about different ways to change and move forward with local partners. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Francesca. Look, we've got time just for one or two clarification questions before we move on, and we'll then have a more extended discussion at the end of all of the talks. Has anyone got any questions they want to ask of Francesca? I was never accused of being a playboy during my PhD. Yeah, and you'll just have to use the microphone, so I'm going to be running around a little bit.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm just curious, taking on board everything you've said, was your view that the project was a success? Did they achieve what they were trying to achieve?
That's a great question and a hard question. I think as critical as I am of both FPAR and PAR, I also think we actually did quite a good job of providing FPAR and PAR activities. And I think the success in our activity was because we were very critical of how we were applying it. And so there was that constant state of self-reflection. And then I think in a sense of development, like removing the methodology of whether the Aka Women's Project was successful, becomes a very difficult question in the sense that the Aka women, they really enjoyed being involved in the activity, and we really heard that from them. And the different ways they chose to participate was, in the end, they actually scrapped our uniforms and they wore their traditional dress and they came and they did cultural song and exchange with us. And that was much more a sense of participation where they really felt empowered to do that. So in that sense, yes. And also there were climate resilient activities that occurred, and that was really successful. But then there's this constant question, which I think I don't have the answer for yet, of the women identified that they wanted a playground, and yeah, they got it through another activity, but is there still that agency that occurs? And I've sort of playing around with this idea of adaptive sovereignty is what I've called it so far. And it's this idea that actually community have much more agency than we acknowledge that they do in these activities, and that they're constantly negotiating. And so yes, they say, yeah, we'll participate in this water project, but what we want is the playground. And so was it successful? Yes, because they got what they wanted, but maybe I guess it depends of whose terms and definitions of the project you're wanting to apply in the first place.
Yeah, Farida.
It was really useful, and it's great to see the pictures too, to get a sense of what was going on. I guess I'm interested in the feminist element of this, because obviously it doesn't require necessarily separation between men and women, but what's important is the identification of kind of structural discrimination, which harms both men and women, So I'm interested at the intersection between climate and gender. What were the issues that did come up? Where was feminist theory useful in identifying issues?
Great question. It's interesting because there were sort of so many layers that were occurring in this space, especially given that my PhD was not actually about climate, and my relationship with the RDA was 2 of my 3 cycles. And so I was much more focused on sort of just like, what does gender targeted, which is what I refer to as any project that's women's empowerment, gender equal, any of those buzzwords, I kind of jam them into one category. And so I was really looking at that space. And interestingly, what I found, which again, maybe relates to the last question, is that climate was not the forefront of the ACCA Women's Project, regardless of the fact that that was the agenda. Women did raise activities and elements of their village that they wanted to improve in that climate space, but they also never said that it was a women's only issue. And they often talk to us about that relationality with men. And the idea really was there were some significant issues. So ACCA communities, there are high rates of violence against women, and there are all of these factors. But the women continuously said, we really want the men to be part of these activities. And I think you're right in that feminism doesn't necessarily require for men to not be in the room. But what I found through my PhD more broadly, looking at gender targeted development, is that that's often the way that it's interpreted. And I feel comfortable saying that because I also somewhat interpreted it that way. And I think, yeah, there's broader, I don't want to speak for too long, but there's broader questions that should be asked about why we sort of perceive it in that way, and why, like, FPAR really, like, when you look at the literature, does say that it's a women-centric methodology, and gender targeted development is synonymous with women's empowerment. And so regardless of the fact that feminism isn't necessarily centering women, the way that those theories are then applied quite openly do center women in those approaches sometimes.
I reckon we'll be picking up some of those in the questions. Thanks, yes. Francesca. And the discussion around agency and negotiation, I don't think leads into locally led development, and that begins to lead into what Nikki's going to talk about, which is, while you're setting up, I'll give you which is redefining rigour and credibility to align with locally led principles of international development practice, and then drawing on some Pacific-led research. So over to you, Nikki.
Thank you so much. So today I invite you to flip the narrative on the two pillars of research that we seem to hold quite dear: rigour and credibility, not to discard them, but to radically reimagine them. So they serve the communities at the heart of our work and not just the institutions who fund it. So I present today with my colleagues metaphorically beside me, and I will introduce them in a little more detail later on, but they are Offa, Viri, Michelle and Niketa, who embarked on this research journey with me, supported by DT Global and DFAT. So this research was done for the Pacific Women Lead program across the Pacific. And it's a case study in how research methodology can redefine rigour and credibility by centering Pacific voices, relationships and experiences, and centering that over externally imposed standards. And we started with this question about what if rigour meant being deeply accountable to those most affected, not just our academic peers? And what if credibility was measured by trust and resonance with the local communities that we want to work alongside? So Pacific Women Lead is DFAT's flagship investment to gender equality in the region. It involves 100 partners with 140 projects and has 5 implementation components. So it's run through SPC, Women's Funds, DFAT's direct relationships, Pacific Women Lead enabling services through DT Global, and has a Pacific Women Lead governance board. It focuses on 3 outcome areas: women's leadership, women's safety, and Pacific ownership. If I could ask the gentleman up the back to press play. This is Jo Kunatumba. She is the team leader for Pacific Women Lead.
Bula Vinaka, my name is Joanne Kunatumba, and I'm the team leader for Pacific Women Lead Enabling Services. I wanted to share some reflections about how the Pacific Women Lead situational analysis came to be. One of the things that we acknowledged when we pulled this report together, that whilst the findings of the report were important for the program, we thought it was equally important to start talking about the methodology we employed, or the process we undertook to pull this report together. When we first started scoping this work, we knew we didn't just want another male product. We wanted something that would help us understand Pacific Women Lead's contribution to gender equality outcomes at the end of the program. After all, it is a male output, but we wanted something that was led by Pacific thinkers, rooted in lived realities and reflective of the complex landscape across the region. Now that vision, it required more than just technical inputs. It needed trust, it needed shared values, and importantly, it needed the support of our donor, DFAT. One of the pivotal moments was gaining the confidence and the buy-in of our colleagues within DFAT who understood what we were trying to do. I also acknowledge that this was not a difficult thing for us to do, in terms of getting the DFAT's buy-in. However, it did require us to be open, to have ongoing conversations, transparency about our approach, and a shared commitment to supporting Pacific-led knowledge. DFAT's openness to something different, to moving beyond traditional consultant-led reports, it was essential. Their flexibility gave us the space to shape a process that was collaborative, contextual, and locally owned. Equally, none of this would have been possible without our fantastic co-authors. This wasn't just a research team, it was a collective of feminists, activists, and experts from across the region, writing from their own experiences, their own contexts. We invested in people that were already working in this space, people embedded in movements that brought credibility and real depth to the analysis that we were hoping to undertake. And along the way, that process became one of mutual learning, reflection, and strengthening connections across the region. This wasn't always easy. There were tensions to hold throughout the many months that we were pulling this analysis together. There were timelines to stretch and competing priorities to balance. But all of us, meaning DFAT, the co-authors, us here at Enabling Services, we stayed grounded in our purpose, and that is that research should not only inform policy, but it also needs to support the people and movements on the ground who are pushing for change. The Pacific Women Lead situational analysis, it's just one example of what's possible when donors and practitioners and researchers come together with a shared vision. It's a reminder for all of us that how we do the work is just as important as what we produce. Vinaka. Gula Vinaka, my name is...
Okay. So as Joe beautifully said, we want to acknowledge our advocates within the system, because this only works if we have advocates. The initial task was a traditional baseline guided by conventional, often Western notions of rigour and credibility. So the emphasis being on more objectivity, credentialed expertise, and distance from the subject matter. But the DFAT team, so Geraldine Tyson at the end there in particular, was a huge advocate for us internally within DFAT to think about a departure from the norm, and together with DT Global understood that business as usual wasn't going to work for this piece of research. So it had to be led by Pacific women. It did need to be responsive to the needs of DFAT, but also to the feminist movements across the Pacific, and it needed to centre the voices of Pacific women as both contributors and validators of the research, and then recipients of the research. So we came to this idea of a formative situational analysis. It's a hybrid of sort of more traditional baseline approaches, but also a situational analysis that was adaptive and avoided locking in activities prematurely, centering these diverse perspectives. So just to acknowledge again, Joe, Junita and Emily from Pacific Women Lead Enabling Services as our advocates, and Geraldine Tyson with DFAT. And then this is our research team. So I stand here to honour the achievements of my colleagues and researchers who couldn't be with me today. And importantly, Michelle, Offer and Viri, who opted in on their own terms. And part of the terms that they came to the table with was an expansion of the priorities and focus of the research to serve the feminist movements in the Pacific, to capture the knowledge to date that would serve and inform how they were going to work in the long term. So the chapters were co-authored or heavily informed by these Pacific practitioners and advocates. And the co-authorship approach means that each chapter, as you read through, has a very distinctive style and voice. Some adopt more Western approaches, some adopt sort of a hybrid approach, and some adopt feminist Tala Noa approaches, as in Offer's chapter. The Pacific authors demonstrated a strong willingness to engage in these collaborative approaches, but importantly, what they brought to the table was a credibility with the audiences, the movement, the activists, the practitioners, and so they were the ones that actually ensured the rigour and the credibility from the outset. Our purpose and our collaborators, so this is Pacific Women Lead Partners, they come together each year. And they are from diverse areas of the Pacific. They're from government, they're from NGOs, they're from rights movements, they're from local organisations. Our product, which you can find on the Pacific Women Lead website, I'm not going to spend too much time. It is worth having a look at, especially the methodology section, but you can find it there. But most importantly, I want to talk about our process. So much of international development research is still governed by this unspoken hierarchy of knowledge, where Western academic methods are seen as rigorous and everything else is measured against this standard. But we know that rigour and credibility are not neutral and they are defined by power. So in early conversations, my colleague Offer kept asserting to us that Pacific ways of knowing should not have to be legitimised by Western research traditions. And so it was up to us to have those really honest conversations with Jerry, our DFAT colleague, to say what will it take to bridge these two worlds, ways of knowing and ways of capturing knowledge and validating knowledge in such a way that we can meet your needs, but also serve these communities. In the context of Pacific Women Lead, which aims to promote women's leadership, realise women's rights, to have adopted any other approach would be to really lack credibility in the eyes of those we're working with. And so for us, there was no alternative. So our process had to be Pacific-led, rely on Pacific methodologies. The perspectives of Pacific women and girls had to be centred at every stage. And we went through a collective validation process with 70 stakeholders from the region. That meant that all the evidence was brought to them. We engaged in dialogue to think about how to make sense of the evidence, what the findings might be, and then these 70 stakeholders were the ones that came up with these recommendations, and that formed the basis of the report. By including these oral histories, collective memory and lived experience, we actually surfaced insights that we couldn't find through peer-reviewed academic articles. The barriers to publishing in peer-reviewed academic articles and blogs meant that we were actually missing, for example, the unintended consequences of donor-funded models of convening that disrupted traditional networks. We then shared the knowledge back with partners, practitioners and the movement. So every year, these same stakeholders come back together through an annual reflection and learning process. They use this situational analysis to reflect on the evidence and lessons learned over the year and to see where the shifts are happening, whether the recommendations have been implemented, and use that to inform their next steps. So Pacific Women Lead's methodology redefined rigour as ethical, relational, contextually grounded engagement, and credibility was defined as trust and validation by those most affected by the work. By centering Pacific women's voices and leadership, employing these culturally resonant methods and shifting power and accountability, it demonstrated that local-led research not only meets but exceeds the standards of quality and impact set by conventional approaches. So for us, centering the voices meant asking the questions of credibility for whom? For us, it was community validation. Trust from whom, legitimacy through relationships with those most affected, and accountability to whom, shifting power to local advocates and knowledge holders. So in this context, rigor was about relevance, not just objectivity. Equal partnerships that prioritise reciprocity and care, embracing diversity in methodologies and epistemologies, and tailoring methods appropriately. Advocacy required at all levels of the system was really, really critical. So we couldn't have done this work without advocates from DFAT, DT Global, and these researchers themselves. And an appreciation that it's not an all or nothing approach. It's a process and a journey. So I just want to close with a timely reminder from Dr. Transform Agora. The future of Pacific development should not be dictated by donors, but shaped by Pacific people and for Pacific people. And this is an example of how we do it.
Thank you, Nikki. And actually, I think that's going to provide a nice bridge between the previous talk and the one that's just about to come. Has anyone got any questions they want to ask of Nikki, just to clarify anything at this point? Otherwise, we'll pick it up. Okay, thank you. I've got about 3 that I'm but we'll hold our fire on that. So our next speaker is going to be online. So Ujwal, your face is about to appear 10 feet wide in front of us. While Ujwal's coming up, his talk is called Informing the Official Mind, an exploration of the political economy of research uptake at DFAT. Full disclosure, a number of years ago, I oversaw, when I was at the Office of Development Effectiveness in DFAT, the strategic evaluation they did on research uptake started out AusAid, it wound up DFAT. And we were critical on a number of things, but I'm sure it's all been resolved since then, Ujwal, so I'm expecting a really positive story. Over to you.
Right, thank you, Tom. So I do have some slides, and I was wondering if they can be pulled up, or I could share my screen.
I'm being told that you should share your screen. It's probably easier.
I'll do that.
We can see it, but you might just want to. There we go. Yep, now it's in the slideshow. Go ahead.
Excellent. So I'll start, and as Tom has already told you, I'll be talking about the political economy of research uptake at DFAT, which was what my PhD research, which concluded late last year, was based on. And I'll jump straight in. So globally, total ODA spending stands at around $245 billion US. Yet how research shapes decision-making within aid agencies is poorly understood. The individual and organizational levels of decision-making are even less well understood. Now, academic scholarship has not directly focused on the political economy of research and knowledge within international development. So as Denny and Domingo suggest, that while researchers now consistently underline the importance of understanding the political economy of developing countries and donors that support them, in order to achieve better aid outcomes, the research industry remains largely ambivalent about questions of our own political economy, and the political economy of bilateral donors themselves internally within is perhaps even less focused on. It's largely to do with looking at the political economy of of the context within which aid is being administered. Now, this affects the ability of bilateral donors to take steps in the direction of making their work more research and evidence-based. My PhD was an attempt at exploring how research is or is not being used in development policy and programs. I addressed gaps in the study of the political economy of donor agencies themselves and focused on the importance of understanding the interplay between political authorizing environments, that's Dan Honig, and organizational behaviors within donor agencies, ideas which come from Nilima Gulrajani at ODI. And this would help relate macro level policy influences to the organizational and individual levels of decision making. Some of you may have heard of Jack Corbett's 2017 book, where he identifies 3 domains, the policy, technical, and administrative, that stem from the narratives that key actors have constructed to manufacture legitimacy for the Australian aid program. Corbett describes aid policy as dependent on the court politics of Canberra policymakers, with constant oscillations occurring from one domain of legitimacy to another at any given point of time. Now, I argue that the court politics of aid policy are also shaped by a wider set of actors who hold varying degrees of power and influence depending on their proximity to policymakers, their disciplinary and institutional backgrounds, and the strength of their intellectual networks in Australia and in other Western contexts. So as we know, AusAid's integration theoretically presented an opportunity to achieve cultural assimilation into DFAT. But in practice, many observers found that it led to cultural displacement, with DFAT effectively swallowing AusAid. What happened earlier on was the Australian aid program had historically established its technical legitimacy on the basis of a core group of generalist public servants who had built up considerable knowledge and expertise in aid delivery. This model was gradually complemented by the appointment of sectoral specialists to enhance AusAid's analytical capabilities and to build an understanding that aid bureaucrats have a greater knowledge burden than other government departments, given their work in diverse countries and sectors. Following the integration of AusAid, several AusAid staff left DFAT, leading to the remaining expertise in aid and development being more thinly spread. The number of in-house specialist positions was reduced, both in Canberra and at Post, and some senior managers overseeing development programs lacked development expertise. This trend heightened during the COVID-19 pandemic, with a hollowing out of experienced personnel who possessed a combination of generalist and specialist experience. Now, my research was centered around the primary question: when do development agencies use research? To explore this overarching question in greater depth, I also asked, how is research use influenced by individual understandings and strategies, which is the micro level, via what institutional mechanisms is research used, which I call the meso level, and how is research use influenced by the external policy environment and internal organizational dynamics, and we veer more towards the macro level here. Now, during a 3.5 period of embedded research with the DFAT-funded Developmental Leadership Program, or DLP, which was an international research program that focused on the role of politics, power, and leadership in development, I observed DLP's engagement with DFAT, as well as with its various project teams around Asia and the Pacific. I also conducted interviews with a range of actors in the Australian development sector to understand the value and use of research at an individual and organizational level, and how macro level political dynamics influence them. And this is DLP's website, and in case anyone's interested in looking at our material. Now, what I found, and I start with the micro level, was that the agency of motivated individuals, despite structural and organizational constraints in their use of research, can be highly effective. Bureaucrats are influenced naturally by their own understandings of what constitutes good research. And these understandings are often based on their internalized notions of evidence hierarchies. But the implicit biases of DFAT staff were largely influenced by dominant ideas emerging from Western institutions and thinkers. And peculiarly, the Australian phenomena of a certain kind of cultural cringe was found to make them more receptive to ideas emanating from influential international development actors, particularly those from the US and the UK, and probably less so from by ideas emerging from other contexts. And organizational confidence and hubris, which was described as such, that they knew everything that was going on, that was what one of the respondents said, seemed to shape DFAT's personality-driven culture. And I'm quoting respondents here. Norms and attitudes towards research were also found to be influenced by such hubris, rendering a translation from research into practice very difficult. Now, this quote is one that sort of stayed with me, and this was a former DFAT official reflecting on her on their time at DFAT, and they say the fundamental premise of wanting to engage in research is an assumption that you don't know the answer to things, and they found that this sort of cultural norm doesn't really exist much within certain kinds of institutions in the Australian government, and the kind of grace and humility that comes with that fundamental premise, they found that to be a highly unusual way of being. And the kind of people who came to the table with that kind of an attitude was quite rare. However, some DFAT officials knew how to find politically savvy methods to what was described as work the system, despite constraints and barriers. And developmentally oriented bureaucrats exhibited intrinsic motivation and the political nous to generate interest and buy-in from colleagues across the department and promote research uptake of their particular research investments. And so motivated bureaucrats exhibited individual agency in promoting research use despite the constraints they faced. Interestingly, they also used various shortcuts to access research, such as following handles strategically on social media. These strategies were employed both out of individual interest and curiosity, and out of a desire to most effectively access diverse sources of research, given the severe time constraints within which they operate, which I'm sure Tom will sympathize with. These strategies provide useful pointers on how bureaucrats may optimize their access to research, even though they may not have a very direct access to, say, things like journal articles or even time to read them. Now, I'm moving to the meso level. Even though they are often perceived as forces of inertia, existing business practices within DFAT can be harnessed for positive change. Respondents found that DFAT's program cycle, given its centrality to their organizational practices, offered various opportunities to integrate research, though they often differed in their perceptions and interpretations of the degree to which these opportunities were actually seized. Multiple DFAT officials who were interviewed tended to begin their narration of the various stages of the program cycle where research can be useful at the program design stage, though there were disagreements over how well research is used at this stage. Depending on the degree to which research is baked into program design, the procurement stage was also found to be one of the most influential by some respondents, serving as key influence points where incentives were established for the kinds of research that are valued and signals sent out to the market at large, if I may put it that way. Now, one might expect the review and evaluation stage would have elicited greater association with the potential of research use in monitoring and evaluation and related activities. But most respondents, interestingly, found that it was not a particularly propitious opportunity. And one DFAT official said that evaluation tends to not be very research heavy. It will reflect the views of key informants and things like that, but it tends to be a bit less reflective and has a tendency to be quite instrumental. Now I'll move to the macro level. Now, at the macro level, the preoccupation with geopolitical, economic, and security rationales have historically held a degree of influence over the aid program, a trend that was strengthened after the integration of AusAid into DFAT. But even before integration, the nebulous concept of the national interest was challenging to understand, since senior AusAid staff would functionally deal with relatively junior DFAT staff who found themselves often unable to provide clear guidance on what the national interest actually constituted. In fact, perhaps there were some risk-averse tendencies there where you did not want to clearly articulate what that was. This made it hard to understand long-term priorities and shape the approach to designing and commissioning research investments. This is compounded by the fact that incentive structures for career progression within DFAT, climbing the greasy pole, are not often well aligned with the objective of building and maintaining development expertise. And after the integration of AusAid, bureaucrats with a development background often found themselves sharing space with officials and diplomats adhering to very different worldviews and reference points, which was recalled by a DFAT official who said it's not really animosity, but it's literally two different backgrounds coming together. It's a bit like an engineer talking to an interior decorator at different, and that seems to be the ethos of how the situation was at the time. Even though they largely remained part of the development ecosystem, in their new roles, ex-Aus aiders or WAS aiders were not always directly available to DFAT, and at best were contracted through commercially negotiated arrangements, which changed their incentives and affected DFAT's access to internal corporate knowledge and institutional memory. A peculiar phenomena sort of emerged among some interviewees where perceptions of their authorizing environments were almost besieged by individuals of differing worldviews. And this phenomena emerged across both orthodox economists, people of that background, who felt that they don't have enough of their own around them anymore. But also the same phenomena occurred for political economy-oriented aid bureaucrats who felt that there was an onslaught of technocratic thinking around them, which was interesting. Seemed to be a kind of a feeling of being besieged by the other across people of different worldviews.
Ujwal, 2 more minutes.
Yeah, I'll finish quickly. So what are some of the reflections that emerged from this research? Firstly, there might be value in promoting internal contestation within DFAT. And this requires motivated bureaucrats who are excited by research from different quarters. They thrive in intellectually stimulating environments and also through exposure to different sectoral areas and disciplines. But the question is, who gets to criticize? The privilege of criticism is often restricted to academics and researchers who are closer to Canberra and who inform the court politics of aid policy making. And there needs to be a wider cross-section of people who have access and the ability to criticize or offer suggestions. Internal champions were found to be crucial, and research programs funded by DFAT need sustained long-term engagement with intellectually curious, politically savvy bureaucrats who act as internal champions and enable uptake and buy-in from internal audiences. But also the continuity of staff and their relational work with research partners not only makes for better research, but dramatically increases the probability of research uptake. There needs to be more cross-disciplinary engagement, particularly to benefit staff who have not had exposure to a certain sectoral area before. And this is a broader problem of bureaucracies where generalist tendencies are predominant. And finally, being open to different forms of evidence and research includes being open to different ways of knowing and being. And it's not feasible or desirable to encourage Australian bureaucrats to shun Western knowledge and modes of thinking, but it is worth reinforcing the value of immersing themselves in other ways of looking at the world. This might help transcend the echo chamber of dominant ideas from prominent Western institutions and thinkers. And this could happen through more systemic engagement with Global South researchers and experts that could help amplify local research that is either overlooked or is filtered through a Western lens before reaching decision makers. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ujwal. Look, I'm quite conscious of time, but by the way, thanks so much for that, Ujwal. I'm so glad that I agreed to chair this session. There's so much there we can talk about. But look, what we might do is just go straight to Kate's. I'm sure a lot of you have got questions for Ujwal, and I'll just get you to hold on to those just for a few minutes. Kate will be talking about when evidence undermines impact, preconditions and red flags for catalytic impact measurement and management in development finance. So we'll go straight into you, Kate.
Cheers. Hi, everyone. So before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm actually down from the land of the Gadigal, of the Gubbi Gubbi people up on the sunny coast, and it's always nice to come back to Sydney, so great to see you all. I also just want to ground this presentation today probably in the broader context from which it emerges. So I'm a PhD student currently at the Institute for Sustainable Futures here at UTS, and I'm in the final stage of my research into regenerative development finance. So the core question I sought to address as part of this PhD was quite simple. The answer isn't, but it's another matter. Why aren't funds reaching where they're most needed for development? I've grounded my journey of exploration over the past few years heavily in the emerging paradigms of regenerative development and regenerative finance. And this includes mapping the emerging trends from development studies or development practice and development finance to understand the visible disconnect between development need and capital flows, and also the less visible barriers that keep both finance and development locked in extractive rather than regenerative dynamics. So the focus of my current research, or this particular part, and of this presentation today, is on how the very evidence systems designed to prove impact, particularly in the context of development, may in their current form actually be undermining it. And so that's the question we're asking today. So the research to date, I guess my research up to this point, has shown two supposedly aligned fields pulling in completely different directions. And this is particularly ironic, particularly given sort of this has been happening over the past decade. So in 2015, the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was set at the Third International Finance for Development Conference, should have set this new common direction, if you like, for development and finance. However, the fundamentally different approaches adopted by these two fields evidently weren't factored into the equation. And so this continues to create this divergence rather than convergence when we need it most. One manifestation of this acute difference is in the sphere of impact measurement and management specifically. So development practice emphasizes or places the emphasis on participatory learning and contextual responsiveness. Post-development theory, which emerged in the late 90s and underpins much of development practice today, highlights the need for locally led responses to development. And this means measurement that's centered on local agency and knowledge. Grounded in social science, development practice also acknowledges that when dealing with development, we're dealing with complex adaptive systems. As such, impact measurement and management, or monitoring and evaluation in this context, is used primarily or predominantly as a tool for learning and adapting. In contrast, development finance places the emphasis on accountability, standardization, and metrics-driven validation. Standardization of metrics, which is required for capital efficiency and enforced sort of top-down as a condition for capital provision, is completely at odds with the locally defined approaches required for effective development practice. Following Addis Ababa in 2015, which promoted the mobilization of private capital for development, there was even greater need to report and validate attribution of capital to outcomes. This concept of attributing inputs to outputs in a linear construct, so this cause and effect, is just simply not a viable approach in the context of complex adaptive systems. So that's I guess, the diverging trend that we've been seeing. And so it's not altogether unsurprising that IMM, at least in the development finance context, is currently in a field of flux. In addition to sort of these competing priorities that have existed since inception due to the inherent differences in these two fields, we've more recently seen, with the rise in popularity of systems thinking and associated movements like systemic investing in the finance world, we're seeing pockets of the financial sector acknowledge that impact in complex systems is not wholly knowable or attributable to one actor. So that's exciting. And so there are now calls to reposition IMM in finance as an engine for learning, improvement, and systemic change, which is much more aligned with the long-standing approaches in development practice. And so my research really leans into this current exploration by evaluating the IMM frameworks themselves. So looking at the frameworks that are being used in development finance to shed light on some of those less visible barriers I mentioned earlier that are keeping finance and development locked in extractive rather than regenerative dynamics. So to achieve this, I'm applying sort of a two-phased approach. The first is a diagnostic phase, which is what I'll largely be discussing today, and that's exploring the structural features of IMM frameworks that constrain or catalyze greater impact. And then I'll lead into sort of just touch briefly on the second design phase, which is exploring more how IMM frameworks and systems might be designed to support regenerative development and transformation. And I welcome any and all feedback on all of this, because both of these phases are ultimately sort of going to feed into my final thesis. So none of this is fixed. Welcome any insights you might have. So let's start with phase one, the diagnostic. So the methodology for this phase was initially largely grounded in broad literature review to construct a basic typology of IMM frameworks, and then to identify, I guess, preliminary design levers. So what are the preconditions or red flags for what I like to call catalytic IMM, that is IMM that actually generates greater impact. And then I developed those further by creating a taxonomy against which I could basically evaluate the regenerative nature of those IMM frameworks. Then went on to a sort of a structured content analysis across 11 of the most widely used IMM frameworks in the finance space, which were scored against the taxonomy criteria, and then findings were sort of supplemented with insights from grey literature and discussion with IMM practitioners. And that then led into phase two. So the typology, relatively basic. It was just to get three categories, but to classify the IMM frameworks as I went through the evaluation process. So basically we have the extractive frameworks on one side and the catalytic frameworks on the other, and some high-level sort of indications of what they look like or what categorizes them. The red flags and preconditions were a little more detailed and nuanced. So these were drawn from findings in M&E and IMM literature. And some examples, these are just some of the examples shown on the screen. So in general, catalytic IMM is IMM that generates greater impact outcomes. So unsurprisingly, this involves participatory approaches to impact measurement and evaluation, an equal value on qualitative and quantitative data, a systems approach to impact mapping, and iterative learning and adaptation cycles. Extractive IMM, on the other hand, focuses narrowly on short-term or project investment-based outcomes, quantitative metrics, and provides little benefit or value by way of feedback to communities or practitioners in the field. So building on the typology and these, what I'm calling, I guess, sort of design levers, I developed a regenerative taxonomy to evaluate the regenerative potential of the IMM frameworks most commonly used to finance development today. That taxonomy drew on three core knowledge domains, so systems evaluation and complexity theory, developmental and utilization focused evaluation, and regenerative design and development, the Regenesis Institute, Edward Muller, and regenerative finance, largely what's coming out of the Capital Institute. This was I guess, is sort of the core feature of the diagnostic phase. So it sets out three core dimensions and a series of associated evaluation criteria, which were largely a structured extension, if you like, of the design levers. The first dimension relates to IMM design conditions. So how is the framework constructed and who gets to define impact? The next dimension relates to impact flow dynamics, and that looks at how does the framework shape impact over time and across systems. And then the third dimension is all about systemic feedback and regenerative capacity, which explores whether the system evolves, regenerates, and returns value to those affected. I don't know if we're, in the interest of time, we're going to have time to delve into all of those, but I'm happy to share insights with anyone at the end. The types of questions that are sort of being asked here, though, are like, to what extent does the framework support participatory development? Does the framework guide users to develop or interrogate a theory of change that situates their work within a wider system? Does the framework acknowledge who controls impact data and decisions about what counts as success, which comes to your question earlier? In impact flow dynamics, it's really about, does the framework encourage recognition of multiple interconnected interventions, or is it focusing narrowly on sort of single point activities? Does it support tracking of indirect or cross-sector effects? And does it support analysis of how outcomes relate to wider system change or results treated in isolation? And the last, systemic feedback and regenerative capacity dimension, this is really about the framework explicitly promoting the use of feedback to inform decision-making, adjustment and learning. So is the framework designed to include, solicit or respond to feedback from those most affected by the interventions? Does the framework support system resilience and conditions for continued impact beyond a specific intervention? And is there recognition of multi-directional accountability? So to funders, but also to the communities and beneficiaries. So the 11, these were the frameworks that were effectively part of the evaluation, and these were chosen based on 4 key criteria, basically their institutional relevance, if they were developed or endorsed by influential actors, their operational use, domain coverage. I was looking for ones that covered both impact finance and innovative finance as well as pure development finance, and their conceptual influence, so the degree to which they're cited in IMM literature and the rest. The findings weren't great, but also not altogether surprising. So 5 were found to be extractive, 5 transitional, so they exhibited a mix of high and medium scores with partial alignment to regenerative principles, but they were constrained by legacy structures, top-down logic, or institutional inertia. And there was only one that demonstrated catalytic tendencies, and that was the UNDP SDG impact standards. So the core insights emerging out of all of this was that participation was often symbolic and not structural. And often, weirdly, it's at odds with adaptability. And this is closely connected to the constraints that are presented by the linear thinking and sort of log-frame theories of change that tend to get used. Paradoxically, the rigid planning tools such as these can institutionalize static logic under the banner of participation. So the more people that participate in developing the logic of the program, the more difficult it is going to be to adapt the program to a rapidly changing environment. And that reveals a real structural dilemma, particularly for regenerative practice, which depends on both inclusive participation and real-time adaptability. And those 2 values are often undermined by these more static or linear structures. The linear theory of change is also a core driver for the neglect of negative effects, because there is this tendency to construct a theory of change around the positive intent and the impact that's going to happen, and the negative just sort of falls off the radar or isn't factored in or considered or measured, which can be problematic. Other insights relate to sort of temporal myopia, not considering beyond the time frame of the project itself. And yes, all in all, basically they suggest that mainstream IMM frameworks continue to carry design features that tilt towards extractive logic. Hence the conclusion that current IMM systems in development finance, due to the way they define and operationalize evidence, appear to be compromising rather than catalyzing impact. In the interest of time, I'll just jump to,
Thanks, Kate.
These are sort of just some questions to think of at the end, and it's really just to highlight this, disconnect, if you like, between development practice and development finance. From the poll, it seems that many here, there was a poll, by the way, it seemed that many of you do use it for learning and adaptation, which isn't surprising given you are development practitioners. But given the way development finance approaches this, do you feel that enhances or compromises your ability to access funding? And it's really that disconnect or that gap, that it sort of this divergence in how we define and operationalize evidence across these 2 fields that I think is compromising our ability to transform positive intent in both sectors into actual transformational impact more broadly. And now that next phase, which I won't go into, but this is sort of the next phase of the research, is how can we actually design these IMM systems in a way that they're mutually, that they're all pulling in the same direction and aligned in terms of the underlying principles. So that's any feedback and any of this, warmly welcome.
Thanks,
Thank
Kate.
you.
Cheers. That's a lot, and we'll try and unpack some of that. Can I get Francesca and Nikki and Kate just to sit up here? If we can bring Ujwal back on, we'll scrape a few minutes from the next Connect session. Has anyone got any questions? I know I have a number. Yeah, Chris.
Thanks. Maybe putting the last first is perhaps appropriate, Kate. So my question to you is whether the IIMs that you've got are sufficiently complete by way of the institutions that they're attached to. The way I read them is that they're one tool amongst many within those institutions. And so when you refer to at the end coming up with an IMM system that is going to be used by an institution, the presumption kind of infers that you want it to be complete. I do wonder in that way, when you look at something like AIM, which is the IFC, so the International Finance Corporation had this metric system, which is a kind of a risk assessment at the beginning of projects. It is a one very, very simple slither of information that is required of projects. It dismisses all of the other factors that are going to be feeding into those private sector investments. And so for me, it would be interesting to kind of look at it as, don't we fall somewhere in the middle? And if we fall in the middle, how do you reconcile that in terms of from a research and academic sense?
Can I just ask, when you say we fall in the middle of?
The middle of your dualism. So when you refer to the negative and what are the two categories?
Yeah, catalytic and extractive. You mean, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think the reality is everyone's going to use different frameworks, and there is one approach that I found out 2 days before coming, so it is not in there, called the common approach, which is actually designed for that purpose. It's sort of saying, can we find a way to take a myriad of metrics and just find a way to aggregate them in a way that it will meet these? And this is sort of where I think I was coming from when I started this exploration, was if we want development to be owned and defined by the communities themselves, they need to own and define the metrics that determine what they consider to be development. How do you align that with a metric that's coming down from on high regarding what they need to be seeing? Unless there's some mechanism in the middle that protects the community from that, the money's always going to win in a horrible way. And that's why you end up in situations with people planting trees that can't feed their community and can't be built into anything, but they've got a high carbon price. That's the reality of the development frameworks. And so sort of just trying to think, how can we create a framework that actually, rather than it being one framework, its principles to consider in any framework being used are what we're doing here on the financial side of things. Is it considering the realities on the ground, and how are we getting that feedback back? Because that feedback back is the loop that's not happening. So regardless of what they're doing down, and regardless of what they're doing, if we're not constantly feeding that data around, we're not really getting, and that's the extractive part of it, right? So that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's not like I'm seeking one framework that will do it all, more the principles around how we even approach this in the first place.
Other questions? I might do Chair's prerogative. Ujwal. So look, it was wonderful to hear what you said, and Michael and I, who are in the room from DFAT, are immediately thinking that we are that rare type who've got both grace and humility. But there's a couple of things in here which I think really are fascinating. Just one thing, two things to note. I've got a grad in my team who, when integration happened, he was 10. And it's made me realise that this thing that we people of my generation are quite obsessed about means nothing to that several cohorts coming up. The second thing, just while we stay on grads, the expectations as to what they are now expected to be across as generalists is actually quite extraordinary, I think. And I do a lot of training of grads. They're meant to be across development. They're meant to have an understanding of trade. They're meant to also obviously have an understanding of foreign policy. They're meant to have tradecraft and diplomatic tradecraft. They're meant to actually also be across consular skills. They're meant to know how to work at a multilateral level, but then also at subnational levels, etc., etc. They've got to know how to work with ministers' offices, blah, blah, blah. Now, I don't know if these paragons exist. And my question to you is, what were you seeing that might be some sort of structural, in terms of organisational structures, sort of, I guess, green shoots or possibilities that would enable people who are otherwise just going to be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of knowledge and skills they've got to be across just to do a generalist job. Were you seeing anything in your research that suggested there was something that could be possibly built on?
Yes, and Tom, I think that speaks to a lot of what came through. And I spoke to people in DFAT at different levels. So many people who joined much after integration and don't really have much of a background in terms of what AusAid was. I mean, AusAid wasn't perfect, but there was a greater sense of that there were more sort of specialists available at the time. And a model which sort of continued later, even after integration, and then there was a hollowing out of specialization and expertise to some extent at that point. Now, in terms of what you said, the burden on a young grad who joins DFAT in terms of them having such a wide range of abilities and skills is a serious one. But at the same time, there's something systemic also about the notions that are formed in the minds of a young grad in terms of what they feel will be a good route to sort of rising through the ranks within DFAT. And the sense I got from most people I spoke to was that this whole idea of forming a specialization of one area. So even if it's trade, for example, not necessarily just development, if I become too dogmatic about that field and I'm perceived as such, it's going to have negative ramifications. It's going to reduce my relevance to do the big stuff that comes up within DFAT. And in some ways, development and aid work is a very small component of the larger world of what is possible for a young grad within DFAT. So perhaps there's something here to be done at a systemic level where there are some ways of incentivizing a specialization to some degree. So you have some degree of expertise in a particular part of statecraft that DFAT does, and that can be development as well. And if there are ways to sort of send soft signals to grads at training stages, at promotion and hiring even, where this internalized notion of not wanting to be seen as a development person necessarily within DFAT or a trade person or a public diplomacy person. These ideas that these ideas don't necessarily become too pervasive for them, and they don't sort of feel that this quest to be a generalist, quest to be someone who can do different things is something that shapes their career. And there were many cases of people who didn't think that way, but also faced ramifications in their career for trying to buck the trend, essentially.
I mean, it was interesting. It was a question that was posed to us by the DAC of the OECD peer review. Interestingly, some of the results around things such as promotion don't actually match the cultural tropes, but the fact that they're still very resilient cultural tropes is in itself quite telling. Any other questions?
Thank you. My question's for Nikki. I'm interested in, so the approach that you used, it sounded like it was one that was new for your organisation. So I'm just interested in the practicalities of how it changed your role, and were there sort of different skills that you needed to be using to work in this more locally led way?
Sure. So my organisation, Clear Horizon, works a lot in domestically in Australia, in very much like a co-design and a participatory way in deep collaboration with organisations. We have a smaller team that works internationally, and I would say the international, the way we work internationally is a little bit behind the times. I think there's a disconnect between the principles and practice, the flexibility and the ways of working domestically and yielding power in those relationships, and how we're doing that internationally. And part of that is about the systems and structures that we work within. Part of that is about the role that we play, which is quite different. We sort of play this bridging role, brokerage role. We often conduct research or undertake monitoring and evaluation to DFAT standards, for example. And we've got a lot of experience in that. What we're trying to do more and more now is yield power in that space to to support meeting DFAT standards and processes and advocate within those spaces for different ways of working, but also then yield the space of actually undertaking the work to our Pacific colleagues and practitioners, for example, in this work. So we were contracted to do the work. Quickly we realised that we were not best placed to actually conduct the work. What we could do for our time-poor co-researchers was actually do a lot of the background write-ups. So instead of actually undertaking the consultations, which our colleagues were far better placed to undertake, we could just support with writing things up, with testing ideas, and then they would take them back to their communities to test and validate through the workshops. So I think for us it was, number one, unlearning sort of Western standardized ways of thinking about credibility and rigor in research. And number two, it was about really re-examining our role in the process and when we needed to step back.
A final question from anyone? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Great panel. I want to ask, in the context of Indonesia, I find it really interesting how in this conversation, we almost look at the community in the FPAR context, for example, and others. When we look at beneficiaries or communities that we're engaging in, sometimes we look at them as one-dimensionally, as though they're one monolithic, and the dualism is only between the development, like aid workers versus the community. Whereas in reality, within the domestic community, there is power relations and there's its own political economy that then influences how impact is being defined, how outcomes are being defined, and there's that struggle, you know, within the community, right? The example of the wife of the chief of the village is one example of that. Do we just, as long as it's someone from the community, then that's legitimate enough, or should we look at it even more critically? So in the context of development, aid or programs in Indonesia currently, for example, there's some, I don't need to go into it more specifically, but I guess, like this question of like, how can we better acknowledge this additional dimension in how within the community there are different forces that tries to define impact and outcome differently, while we try to criticize and dismantle the rigor and credibility structure. But at the same time, if we open it up, to what extent, you know, how do you accommodate these different needs? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That was a great question. I'll speak to a little bit of it and then I'll pass over to panel members as well. I think it's a really important question, and that really came through in the application of an FPAR process because of this idea that, like, once we get community to participate, then community will all say the same thing, is like what theoretically we're told will be the case. And that really obviously wasn't the case in the Aka communities. And that example of the wife of the village chief made me very uncomfortable because, like, literally we had a board up the top and we were collecting tallies of activities that women wanted to do, and she just went up and wiped them off, the other ones that people had put in. And so for me, I was like, oh, well, is this participation? What do we do in this space? And it just didn't align with my idea that community would all want the same thing, or at the very least, the women within the community would want the same thing. And it was also reflected, what I didn't even touch on was I used photo voice as the method to work with women. And so they were taking photos, and that's the way that we were working with them. And I was asking them to take photos about the opportunities and challenges they had when engaging with community development. And half the women would take photos of their husband and they would say, here's my challenge for engaging with development processes because he limits me. Yeah, which was an interesting outcome of that research. But then the other half was saying, like, we need to work with the men in the room. And so there was this constant duality, and some of that came through hierarchies within the village. So age is a really big thing in Aka communities, and sometimes the older women sometimes were more reminiscent of this traditional cultural practice and they wanted to stay in that element. But then also some of them were the ones that were more pushing for change for the youth in the community. So it wasn't even necessarily a dualism between the community. And so I think that really got me into this space of that adaptive sovereignty that I mentioned a little bit, and I'm still really trying to unpick that. But I think what we need to understand is that there is so much agency within community, and I think development, and again, most of what I say, I feel somewhat comfortable saying it because I have reflected on myself and seen it. So I'm not criticizing the sector, more myself through critical reflection. But I think we sometimes can flatten the experiences of the community, and we can put ourselves into this space of we're delivering development rather than, of course, the agency that the intended beneficiaries have. And then I think more and more throughout this process, I actually realized how much each individual at their agency they have, and the spaces that that community or those villages with the Aka Women's Project that they need to navigate, and they do navigate. It's not even that it's something that the communities aren't doing, but they are constantly negotiating with development programs. And the only reason any development is occurring, or at least in my experiences, is because the community are letting it happen, and they're deciding to engage in that negotiation, and they've decided that they want to engage for whatever reason that may be. So I think the conclusion of these big questions of my PhD so far has just been, I think we need to be transparent about that, and we need to at the very least acknowledge it. And I think in a policy space, in an academic space, that doesn't necessarily happen. I think in a practitioner space, we know it happens, but we don't know how to kind of translate that back to those big decision makers. I don't know if...
Just quick, so part that I didn't touch on at all in this is a large part of what I'm looking at in the PhD is Web3 technologies and the way they're being used to address some of these issues that we're seeing in the disconnect between finance and development, and the way it's being used, particularly at the last mile, for both in terms of getting capital to the last mile, but also in terms of participatory governance within these different communities. So actually giving them a meaningful way to engage and vote on the way that they're that capital's issued within the community, or on any decisions that relate to their community and the way they do things. And the structuring of that voting mechanism can be defined based on whatever the traditional notion of decision making is within that community. So it's not necessarily one person, one vote. It's not necessarily, it would be dependent. Is it consensus based? Is it consent based? Is it agreed? Like, what are the different forms of decision making? And they even change in every single community. So it's quite interesting to see how those technologies are already being applied, but then it raises all of those other fun questions around, digital colonialism and blockchain.
Look, thanks everyone. And look, it is fascinating to hear all of this. I'll be honest, I mean, I've been in the development game in one form or another for nearly 25 years. And there are others in the room who I've seen around the traps who I know have also been, we hear this, like, versions of this were being said 25 years ago. One of the things I find really interesting, though, and some of the things you've been talking about, is the potential for some sort of multi-dimensional learning, as it were, of all the parties engaged in these processes. Just to finish off, I mean, is there anything that you're seeing that strikes you? I mean, you were talking before, Kate, about reflexivity, but, at the sites that you're looking at, this knowledge exchange taking place, which we'll call it research, are you seeing anything that is striking you as being potentially new or interesting in terms of how everyone in the room, be it the donor, the intermediary, the MC, unfortunately Joe's just left from DT Global, but the communities themselves, both the nominal hierarchical leaders and then the actual leaders in a more network sense. Are you seeing anything which is showing that actually everybody is beginning to learn from this, and that we're getting past this thing of get over the one way, the decolonisation, etc., etc.? So just throwing that back to you. Maybe because the thing, sorry, and we'll just finish with this, Nikki, the validation process. I mean, 70 people validating something. My God, how did that?
So that's part of a broader story of Pacific Women Lead, where they have an annual reflection and analysis workshop across their 100 partners, 140 projects. They tested and piloted the methodology for that with partners, with 30 partners, and then they've scaled it. So now they have over 100 participants every year, their partners looking at the data, making sense of the data, developing findings and recommendations together, and a really tangible difference. You asked the question of what's new. Well, suddenly in that room, it's not about what DFAT's doing differently, listening in, it's about, hang on a minute, there's a gap in funding for the North Pacific. Well, the feminist funds are in the room and they say, great, our next funding round is purely North Pacific. And so you have these incredible meaning and lessons derived from the data that exist now in an ecosystem outside the funder completely. And so the value and meaning is taken a life of its own.
Anyone else? Ujwal? Oh, sorry. Ujwal, did you want to say anything?
No, I think please go on.
Okay, sorry, Kate.
No, I was just going to say, I was quite surprised by what is happening in the, let's call it the refi space. So I was exploring regenerative finance and I fell down this refi rabbit hole, which is everything that's happening in decentralized finance, but with regenerative principles in mind. And what they're able to achieve in terms of locally led development and transparency in terms of capital flows and information flows is quite impressive. And yet, and this is the part in the final part of my PhD, is why is traditional finance not exploring, or why are traditional ways of doing things, why is traditional development not embracing this? Why is traditional finance not embracing this? And I think we're all locked in this version of Web3 technology or blockchain technology from 10 or 15 years ago, and that it's not accessible and it's not easy to use and it's crypto and it's financing. And so we've kind of locked that in and we're not actually seeing the good that it is actually currently doing and the complete shift in the way we approach things. So it's completely transforming processes, structures, power dynamics in incredible ways. So yeah, that's where I'm seeing it. Yeah.
And Francesca, any final words on that?
Yes, I will try and be concise for us. I think, so for my wider PhD, I was working with a whole range of stakeholders engaged in gender-targeted development in Laos. So I spoke to development decision makers, I spoke to enactors, and then I also spoke to the community and practitioners. And what shocked me is across the board, everybody identified the same problems and these same conversations that continue to happen. And actually one of my co-researchers described development as a wheel of fire and sort of this like destructive cyclic process that continues to go ahead. And I think the finding of my PhD was hopefully that it's not as destructive as it was described in that process. But I think what did shock me is that all these different stakeholders were aware of the problem and they were all describing the same problem, but they all thought that it was coming from a different actor or a different level in that chain. And so rather than sort of being able to bridge these gaps and understand that we're all parts of this system and we're all experiencing the system together, instead it's kind of this gap between the academics theorize it like this, but the community experiences it like this. So I take away that while that sounds a bit doom and gloom of the wheel of fire, actually a positive is that can we begin to bridge that gap, and can we have events like this where we really bridge all those different voices together and we share our experiences and say, okay, well, what do we do now? We're in that space and we've heard this conversation before, so now how do we change the script?
Great. Can you join me in thanking all of our four speakers? Thanks as well.